It's hard to name any other decade as influential to American cinema as the 70s. The most iconic, groundbreaking, and controversial works of art came from this period. But how?
It was a golden age of filmmaking because we were all single, ambitious, and we were in love with film.
We're going to look at a band of filmmakers who thought they could change the world. And they did.
But first, let's rewind, because it all starts with Hollywood studios and how they responded to a new threat: TV. People of the 60s could begin to watch complex entertainment in their very own living room. Studios grew insecure of this, and their response was to multiply the spectacle. The introduction of 70mm film and the rise in the epic genre made Hollywood slightly more popular, but an abundance in spending led to a huge problem. The biggest example for this was of Cleopatra, the highest grossing film of the time, which still didn't break even. It nearly caused bankruptcy for 20th Century Fox. To worsen the situation, in 1948, a Supreme Court decision made the studio sell all the theatres they owned. Left nearly on its knees, losing money, fans, and a means of distribution, the studios were in desperate need of a solution. The weakening of the studios left executives with no options but to let young, unproven talent have projects they normally would not. These projects were completed on bare budgets, but the directors had direct control over their projects. What did the studio care? They hadn't thrown any money into the project anyway. The code was founded according to the concept that if motion pictures present stories that will affect lives for the better, they can become the most powerful force for the improvement of mankind.
The code sets up high standards of performance for motion picture producers. You want entertainment, wholesome, interesting, and vital.
Whilst it may sound good on the surface, this code prevented writers from exploring complex themes of violence, sex, and even race. With its abolishment came an endless amount of possibilities for stories and characters, ones that pushed boundaries and got audience members to begin questioning morality. By the late 60s, viewers were treated to films like Bonnie and Clyde, Midnight Cowboy, and Easy Rider. Groundbreaking, controversial films that got more people through the doors of cinemas, including new, younger viewers. So now that younger filmmakers were given a higher chance of funding, full creative freedom, and for the first time able to explore taboo themes, what would make them unique in their approach to directing? There were two movements which occurred overseas that influenced the newer 70s filmmakers. Neorealism was an Italian film movement which emerged after the Second World War. After being bombed by the Allies, the studios were no longer available for use. The filmmakers of the time, most notably Vittorio De Sica and Roberto Rossellini, took to making minimal budget films on location with non-professional actors. Furthermore, these films explored the everyday man and his struggles, like in Bicycle Thief, rather than the melodramas people are used to watching. The thing which truly sets them apart is their realism. The glitz and glamour of traditional filmmaking is nowhere to be seen. This was pure, blunt storytelling. The French New Wave was a movement spearheaded by young filmmakers in France. Believing that film had become stale as it lacked sincerity, they thought that the only way to properly portray their lives on film was to break Hollywood conventions. One of the most famous examples of rule breaking came with editing. Jump cuts and juxtapositions became commonly used in this time. Even the coverage of a scene changed. The films were highly unpredictable and felt more authentic because of this. With the movement came a new philosophy: auteur theory and camera stylo. Directors were now encouraged to personalize their films as much as possible, leaving their own visual trademarks throughout. Other key characteristics were faster pacing and more experimental camera movement. The complete disregard of archaic rules in favor of experimental techniques was rebellious for the time, and surely left its mark on the future generations of auteurs. Young American filmmakers such as Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, Peter Bogdanovich, Robert Altman, Woody Allen, Steven Spielberg, and George Lucas were watching these films in art cinemas during their formative years as filmmakers. These films gained an audience, especially with young people across the world, for their bold and distinct style, which separated them from the blasé form the medium had fallen into. The elements which would go on to define 70s films were directly influenced by all these factors. Gritty realism, from neorealism, and cinema verite.
Because we grew up in the cinema verite period of documentary filmmaking, it was a marked influence on how we work.
Rebellious, morally questionable protagonists, a reflection of how people began to question society and politics.
I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore.
Violence came as a result of a change in stories. Exploration of urban life and crime families became more rampant. People of the 70s became fascinated by the criminal anti-hero. Violence also became normalized by 70s exploitation cinema. Highly stylized, encouraged by being taught about various international approaches to filmmaking, from Kurosawa in Japan to Godard in France to Sica in Italy. Filmmakers were given the chance to combine all sorts of experimental styles, edgy narratives. The hippie movement, the civil rights movement, free love, the growth of rock and roll, changing gender roles, and drug use certainly had an impact. The counterculture of the time had influenced Hollywood to be freer, to take more risks, and to experiment with alternative, young filmmakers, as old Hollywood professionals and old-style moguls died out, and a new generation of filmmakers arose. It was a time of social stress, and audiences turned to artists for answers. What do you think about women's rights? What do you think about the war? The moment that society turns to artists for answers, great art will emerge. It's just that simple. It just happens. Back then, movies were at the center of the cultural conversation. Now today, a great number of younger people, my children for example, do not think that movies are important. When audiences don't think movies are important, it's very hard to make important movies. That's the difference.